Election Day may be only 5 days away, but that will likely only be the start of what could be a very contentious legal fight over the results, which could end up in the hands of the Leonard Leo-built conservative majority Supreme Court. We've already seen this court violate its own supposed principles yesterday by allowing Republican officials in Virginia to continue purging voters from its rolls just days ahead of the election. I should note that the 3 liberal justices on the court dissented. And just as he did 4 years ago, Trump is signaling that he will challenge the election results and has begun pushing baseless claims that there's already cheating going on at levels rarely seen before. This comes as there have already been numerous incidents of intimidation around the ballot box. We've seen an 18-year-old in Florida arrested after wielding a machete while confronting a group holding signs promoting Vice President Kamala Harris. There have been fires set at ballot drop boxes in numerous states. In all, it has become a very combustible environment. Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. General Holder, thank you for being here. I want to start with your concerns about the potential levels of violence that we're seeing. There is a video that's circulating all over the internet from Orangeburg, South Carolina, where a man came in and started cursing at and shoving election workers there, a guy in a MAGA hat. We're starting to see sort of, these drop box fire incidents. How concerned are you about this kind of violence?
Wow. Yeah, I've got a degree of concern about that. I mean, we're going to see individuals doing these kinds of things. It's the kind of stuff that Donald Trump, I think, has enabled through his irresponsible verbiage. But I'm also confident that people in law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level will be able to handle any of these things. And I don't think that people should be intimidated, that people should be going to the polls, casting their ballots. And if you are concerned about your safety, and I don't think you should necessarily be, take advantage of early voting or voting by mail. Relatively limited amount of time at this point, but you can still do that.
Let me play a soundbite for you. This is Donald Trump saying something that has caught a lot of folks' attention. Here he is.
And I think with our little secret, we're going to do really well with the House, right? Our little secret is having a big impact. He and I have a secret. We'll tell you what it is when the race is over.
The great Elie Mystal at The Nation says he thinks he knows what the secret is. Quote, he says, I think the plan is to steal the Electoral College outright by getting states Trump loses to refuse to certify the results of their election. That's because the 12th Amendment provides that the president is the person who wins the majority of the whole number of electors appointed. That whole number is supposed to be 538. But one potential reading of the amendment is that Trump doesn't have to win 270 Electoral College votes, but just a majority of however many electors show up. Trump's goal, I believe, is to decrease the number of electors appointed until he wins. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a stretch. I understand what Elie is saying, and I don't know exactly what, this deal is supposed to be like. But we have precedent that indicates that you've got to have a majority of the electors who were selected, and that means you got to have 270. And I also think that possibility that this deal they're going to have would be sanctioned by the courts, even this Supreme Court. I think that is just a bridge too far. So I think, look, we're certainly going to hear all kinds of legal challenges after Kamala Harris wins the vote. We're going to hear non-legal challenges and contentions made by Donald Trump. Donald Trump only has 2 things. I mean, he either wins an election or the election was rigged. And so we can expect to hear that from him. But I actually think that our legal system is capable of handling the kind of specious arguments that they're likely to make.
I think you have more faith in the system than I do. I think anybody who watches the show knows that I don't trust John Roberts as far as I can throw him across the room. I think he's Samuel Alito without the wife with flags. I think he's exactly like the rest of them. And so my question to you is, why should we not believe that Trump can get a couple of his election deniers and fake, electors in Pennsylvania or Georgia to refuse to certify, take that all the way to court as to whether they can refuse to certify, stop a state from being certified, and get that case right to John Roberts, where John Roberts can do what he wants to do. He's a monarchist. He wants Trump to be president. Why should we not believe that Trump has a plan that could be enacted wherein he loses the election, but he gets John Roberts to make him president the way the Supreme Court majority made George W. Bush president?
I've got to tell you, of all the things that I'm concerned about, I'm worried about voter suppression. I'm worried about a whole range of things. But the certification process is one that frankly doesn't concern me an awful lot. If assuming that there is a good count, that's another thing. I want to make sure all votes get counted. And the question just becomes, all right, we've got a result, and now we have to certify that result. And you come up with a whole bunch of reasons why you shouldn't. I don't, illegal folks have voted. I don't know, whatever the rationale is. That's the thing that gives me actually the least amount of concern, because I think there we're going to be deciding cases before judges at the state level, the federal level, potentially at the Supreme Court level if the Supreme Court decides to take a case like that. So I think that when it comes to certification, I think we're going to be just fine.
Okay. All right. Look, you're probably making a lot of people sleep better tonight. Let's talk about the sort of eventuality of a potential Trump in office. He has made numerous threats. He's made over 100 threats to prosecute or punish people he sees as his enemy, from General Mark Milley to Liz Cheney to VP Harris herself. This is stuff that we should take seriously, no?
Yes. Now, if I made you feel okay and like you wanted to go to sleep tonight and, rest peacefully, that's fine. Do not go to bed tonight and rest peacefully when you think about what Donald Trump might do with a weaponized United States Department of Justice. They learned from that first term. And it won't be just who's the attorney general. It'll be who is the deputy attorney general, who's the head of the criminal division, who are the various U.S. attorneys. They'll give U.S. attorneys hiring authority, so they'll have assistant U.S. attorneys who will do the bidding of Donald Trump. And we will see critics of Donald Trump investigated, if not prosecuted. Journalists investigated, if not prosecuted. Companies who take policy positions inconsistent with the desires of Donald Trump, again, investigated, if not prosecuted. And I make that distinction between investigated, if not prosecuted, because the reality is you can ruin somebody's life. You don't have to indict them to ruin their life. You simply have to investigate them. That then gets leaked to the press. There are all kinds of reputational damage that's done to that entity or to that person. There's money that has to be spent to get good lawyers to defend you. And he will use the Justice Department in the way that he has said. Trust him. This is what he has said. This is not something I'm making up. He has said that he's going to use the Justice Department in that way. And that, if nothing else, should drive people to the polls to vote for Kamala Harris.
When it comes to a good night's sleep, Attorney General Holder giveth and he taketh away.